I'm happy to introduce Megan Duff, and today her presentation is a detour in school improvement journeys, how schools are learning and changing in a pandemic. So Meg, welcome. And I know you can't see everybody or anybody, but we're very happy to have you here. So go ahead.
Thank you so much, Matt. Thank you. That was a very kind introduction. Also wanted to thank the Dean's Office for inviting me here today, and all of you for taking the time to come and hear a little bit about what I've been learning in my dissertation research. I know it is a chaotic time, so I appreciate you finding room in your schedules. Today I'm going to be talking about some research I've been doing for my dissertation, Detours in School Improvement Journeys, how schools are learning and changing in a pandemic. And I did want to let you know there's a lot of material for this research that could not be covered in this presentation today. So if you are interested in the director's cut version of this presentation, these slides are available to you on Google Drive. The link is available here. I'll include it again at the end of the presentation. There are copious appendices for those interested in digging in a little further. I want to start today by talking a little bit about my motivation for this study, how this came to be. Why am I, thinking about school improvement now, when all the way back in 1979, Ron Edmonds said, we can, whenever we choose, successfully teach all children whose schooling is of interest to us. We already know more than we need to do that. Whether or not we do it must depend on how we feel and about the fact that we haven't so far. So for over 40 years, we've known how to improve schools, how to create effective schools, and yet we continue to struggle to do so. Here in New York City, we've tried some one-size-fits-all approaches, which are context agnostic. We try to kind of standardize everything for all schools, which fails to account for the fact that schools have different needs. We've also tried completely individualized approaches, which are hyper responsive to school needs, but are inefficient and incredibly capacity intensive, treating every school as though it were entirely unique. We've also tried some attempts at differentiated approaches to improvement, but these approaches tend to group schools based on outcomes. For example, taking all schools with low student test scores, putting them all in a group together, calling them struggling schools, and kind of giving them all the same services or same supports. And all of this kind of suggests the need for a methodological approach and a policy approach that maybe thinks about school capacity and school context a little bit differently. And that's what I want to talk with you about today. And I want to kind of situate the current study in a few different major bodies of literature. The first is the literature on school effectiveness and improvement. And, Edmonds was right. We do know quite a bit about the content of school improvement capacity. Starting back in the late 1970s, early 1980s, researchers have kind of consistently come back to these same core elements that establish a school's improvement capacity, or the school's ability to manage continuous change internally and deal with external pressures in their environment. And these elements include effective leadership, teacher collaboration, academic rigor, a supportive environment, trust, and parent-community ties. In 2010, Tony Breik and his colleagues in Chicago likened these elements to the ingredients for baking a cake. You need all the ingredients for a cake to be successful. If any are absent, it just won't be a cake. Same for school improvement capacity. We need all of these elements for a school to improve. But as anyone who's watched the Great British Bake Off knows, great ingredients without a recipe is not going to be super helpful. So if we turn to some of the literature on school leadership, this body of literature provides some clues around the processes that might be helpful for putting these elements together. After decades of kind of infighting over the best types of leadership for school improvement, you have your kind of instructional leadership camp and your transformational leadership camp, those arguing for distributed leadership. More recently, and I would say more helpfully, there's been some attempt to kind of integrate these different models into an integrated frame of leadership for learning. In 2016, Hitt and Tucker put out a meta-analysis that suggests there are 5 broad domains associated with effective leadership for learning. These include establishing and conveying a vision for the organization, building professional capacity, creating a supportive learning organization, facilitating high-quality learning for all students, and connecting with external partners. And within these broad domains, they identify 28 different practices that leaders can use to help support organizational improvement and change. But those are a lot of practices for leaders to try and juggle. And leaders are largely left on their own to determine which practices to use when. And then a third body of literature kind of looks at school improvement phases and school improvement trajectories more deeply. One piece that is particularly emblematic of this approach is one by Daegu and Sammons in 2016, which looks at this idea that different leadership practices might be more appropriate given a school's position on its improvement trajectory. So the authors find that kind of at the beginning of a school improvement process, leadership may need to be more autocratic. School leaders might need to kind of take the reins, standardize activity, ensure safety and order. Over time, as capacity evolves and the kind of school moves along, the leader can start to distribute more power to teachers and students in the building and become more innovative about their academic approach. But there's this kind of growing understanding that there's a kind of a building block approach and certain structures and capacities that need to be in place before we can move on to some of these other practices. And so the current study tried to figure out how to fit all of these together into one overarching theoretical frame. This is a work in progress. So you'll see leadership at the top, which is catalyzing change through those effective leadership practices. Those influence the elements of the school's improvement capacity, which in turn influence the practices that leaderships utilize. All of this is happening within the broader context of the school or the school's improvement trajectory. But again, school leaders are largely left to kind of figure out what that context is. They're told to diagnose school needs and determine actions appropriately, but there's very little guidance around how to do so, which is where this study kind of fits in. So the current approach wondered if perhaps we could think about school improvement capacity not as a one-size-fits-all issue or as a completely individualized issue, but in terms of perhaps a typology, set number of subgroups. It's focused here in New York City and uses a sequential explanatory research design. So this is a mixed methods approach combining longitudinal quantitative analysis with in-depth qualitative case studies. The first phase, which took place a number of years ago, I'm not going to tell you now, looks at whether teachers kind of perceive their schools to have differing levels of school improvement capacity, so whether there's a typology of school improvement capacities. And then what are the major patterns of change in those school improvement capacities? And this gets at this issue of kind of diagnosing schools' needs. And then the second phase of this study purposefully selects schools from those subgroups identified in the first phase to look at how those different types of schools deal with change. So to offer kind of some resources for school leaders or district policymakers about the different supports that these different types of schools might need based on their position in their improvement trajectory. Like I said, the study is focused here in New York City, which, as many of you know, is the largest school district in the country with over 1.1 million students in over 1,800 schools. This city is under mayoral control, and in 2014, Mayor de Blasio introduced a new, more centralized school structure. and a new vision for school improvement, which is very conveniently based on those elements of improvement capacity that I mentioned a few slides ago. So the city has been actively focused on these elements since around 2014. Further importantly, New York City was an early epicenter of the COVID-19 pandemic here in the United States, prompting an urgent need for schools to change. March 16th marked the first day that schools across the city closed down, prompting 75,000 teachers to figure out how to shift to virtual instruction in under 1 week. Since that time, schools have been dealing with a constantly shifting and uncertain policy environment that continues to this day. There is a brief and beautiful window for about 2 months this fall when all schools offered in-person instruction. About 25% of students in New York took schools up on that offer, and there have been substantial gaps in terms of student racial ethnic background around who is actually attending in-person instruction. Currently, elementary schools are offering in-person instruction, but middle schools and high schools have gone to fully remote learning. So let's dive into the nitty-gritty. This first phase, latent transition analysis, again, the purpose of this phase was to identify different types of schools based on teacher perceptions of improvement capacity, as well as major patterns of change in improvement capacity from 2017 until 2019, so leading up to the COVID-19 pandemic. And I opted to use latent transition analysis for this phase of the study because unlike models that look at student outcomes or observed indicators and maybe changes in student outcomes over time, I was interested in modeling schools around unobserved constructs, in this case, their capacity for improvement. So I needed a method to group schools by an unobserved trait and to look at how that unobserved trait changes over time. Latent transition analysis functions similarly to factor analysis, but instead of trying to group factors around underlying constructs, it allows us to group organizations around underlying constructs. So it's kind of a holistic organizational approach. Many people compare it to cluster analysis. The main difference is that cluster analysis, you're kind of self-imposing cut points on what counts as a group, whereas in latent class analysis, it's a model-based approach. So you are able to mathematically test how well your model fits the data. This is the full latent transition analysis model that I run. We are only going to talk about the highlighted parts of this model today in the interest of time and all of your sanity. So in the two kind of circles in the center here, you have the latent classes at 2 time periods. C1 is 2017, C2 is 2019. The assumption is that school improvement capacity is categorical, that there are distinct groups at each of these time points, and that these groups can be represented or identified based on teachers' perceptions of observed indicators, in this case, effective leadership, collaboration, family community ties, all those elements of school improvement capacity that we've been kind of touching on all along. Here in New York City, these elements are measured in a teacher school climate survey using remarkably consistent survey items over time, which allows us to look at changes in the latent classes over time, given these kind of repeated measures. I use 6 different publicly available data sets in this analysis. I use these publicly available data sets, 1, because I could easily access them, but 2, because these are data sets that district leaders have access to themselves. And so it's also kind of demonstrating a way that policymakers could leverage the data at their disposal to think a little differently about how we could group schools for improvement. So the first, like I said, the 2017 and 2019 teacher school climate surveys, which are available on the New York City Info Hub. They've been measuring the essential elements for school improvement since 2015. all responses are aggregated to the school level, and the response rate on these surveys is over 80%, so that eliminates any issues of selection bias. I also kind of combined those with the 2017 and 2019 state school report card database so that I had additional data about student outcomes, and then the 2017-2019 school administrative database to include covariates around school, teacher, and student kind of demographics and factors. My final sample includes all schools serving students in grades 3 through 8 that administer the annual math and ELA exams, so 1,225 New York City schools. And here's what I find. First question, to what extent do teachers have differing perceptions of school improvement capacity? It turns out of those 1,225 different schools, there are 6 groups of schools based on how teachers see their improvement capacity. I want to briefly talk about how to look at this figure because it can be a lot. On the x-axis at the bottom there, you have all of those elements of school capacity. The y-axis are the proportion of teachers with an above average endorsement of each element. So lines that are closer to the top of the y-axis, teachers perceive schools to be stronger in those elements. Lines that are closer to the bottom are perceived to be weaker in those elements. Similar to factor analysis, where the researcher names the factors based on the kind of underlying variables, in LTA, you name the subgroups based on kind of the strengths and weaknesses in each class. So these names are still up for debate. Interested to hear what you all think. The first group I find I have called the versatile group. These are schools that teachers perceive to be strong across all elements of improvement capacity. So these are our highest improvement capacity schools. The second group I've called collaborative. These are schools that are high across all kind of adult stakeholders in the building. You see strong leadership, strong teacher collaboration, strong trust, and strong parent-community ties, but pretty low levels of academic rigor and supportive environment, suggesting perhaps these are schools where the adults have kind of banded together to help support what they see as weaker student academics and student behavior. The developing subgroup is also above average on all indicators, but not quite as strong as that versatile group. Could mean that the teachers in these schools are a bit more critical of their organization, but it could also mean that the schools are not quite as far along as the versatile group. Still important to point out that they do have all those elements of improvement capacity mentioned back at the beginning. This balkanized group I've named because they are very low in instructional leadership, professional development, and teacher leader trust. Though they have higher, above average levels of academic rigor and student behavior, these are kind of ships without captains. There's no one kind of guiding the school. Representing the opposite of the balkanized group are my controlled schools. These are schools where you see above average levels of leadership, teacher leader trust, but the academic rigor and the environment are lacking, suggesting these are schools where perhaps leaders have tightened the reins a bit to try and bring up the academics. And then at the bottom are the demoralized subgroups, so named based on the work of Charles Payne on kind of the intractable failure in urban school context. And these are schools that teachers perceive to be weak across all elements of improvement capacity. And then the second question, what are the major patterns of change in school improvement capacity over time? It's important to point out that the subgroups themselves remained consistent between 2017 and 2019. That does not have to be the case, but that is what I found in my model. But the schools that exist in those subgroups do in fact change. I don't want to spend too much time on this diagram, though I do personally find it very interesting. But I'll point out a few things. First, on the left side, you have the 2017 improvement capacity. On the right side, you have where schools were in 2019. You'll notice, first of all, the versatile subgroup is the largest in both time points. Unfortunately, the second largest group is the demoralized group at both times. And the size of the groups remains relatively similar over time, though the composition of those groups does change rather substantially, though again, this varies based on class. For example, the versatile subgroup is relatively stable. 75% of schools that were versatile in 2017 remain versatile in 2019, which makes sense. Schools that were initially strong tend to kind of continue to be strong over time. The most common trajectory for versatile schools was to move to that developing group. So perhaps a little waffling between being extremely effective and just effective, but no kind of major changes. Kind of at the opposite end of the spectrum, the demoralized schools are also relatively stable, with just over half of schools that were demoralized in 2017 remaining so in 2019. Sorry. Those schools that did shift, however, the most likely trajectory was into the controlled subgroup. So about 1/5 of demoralized schools shifted up to that controlled group, which kind of harkens back to that Daegu and Salmon study from earlier, suggesting schools that are starting out on their improvement journey, the leaders might be tightening the reins a bit to try and bring up some of those academics and some of that capacity. And then one more I wanted to look at is that controlled subgroup. About 30% of schools remained in that controlled group, but there were very different trajectories for schools that did change from 2017 to 2019. About 30% of schools moved from the control group to the demoralized group. So schools were equally likely to stay controlled or to kind of move back into that demoralized category. On the other hand, nearly 1/4 of schools moved up into that collaborative group, which you'll remember kind of mimics the controlled group in terms of academic rigor and student behavior, but is much stronger in terms of leadership, teaching, parent outreach, suggesting some very different pathways that schools can take. And one open question raised by this is, what would make a school that was originally controlled move to the collaborative subgroup versus, say, the demoralized group? It's not something I'm able to get into in this study, but it's certainly a question for future research. So you're welcome to, like I said, look through the appendices for a lot more on different trajectories, but I did want to highlight some of the key takeaways from this phase of the study. Again, teachers received 6 types of school improvement capacities among all New York City elementary and middle schools: versatile, developing, collaborative, balkanized, controlled, and demoralized. Further, these capacities are malleable, and some trajectories are more common than others. Third, this is important, and that it is not an ordinal solution, meaning we're not just moving from kind of low to high capacity, but that schools are stronger and weaker in different areas, suggesting they may need different improvement supports based on areas of strength and weakness, which perhaps provides some evidence that a differentiated approach to improvement may be possible. So one could imagine an approach for those kind of collaborative schools where the issue is really the academic rigor and the student behavior that's really academically focused, as opposed to maybe the balkanized schools where you really need to increase some of the leadership in the building. Now, what I've done for the current study is kind of take these subgroups and these improvement capacities from phase 1 and use them to think about how schools are coping with change in the comparative case studies for phase 2. And this is, looking at the, big question that all of you are here to learn more about: how different schools are coping with the COVID-19 pandemic. Anticipated data collection will be occurring over 10 months. It started in June 2020 and will be wrapping up in March 2021. The anticipated sample will include 12 schools purposefully selected from the results of the latent transition analysis in phase 1. There are 2 schools per improvement capacity type, one that was stable from 2017 to 2019 and one that changed between that time. 4 interviews are being conducted per school, 1 with the principal, another with a second formal leader, and 2 with teachers in the building, for a total sample of 48 semi-structured interviews. The current sample includes 11 schools, 40 interviews across those schools, including a mix of kind of respondents. So you're getting, while not the whole sample, a pretty good sense of what these schools are dealing with. I will also note that 20 of these interviews occurred over the last month. It has been a real battle to find schools with the capacity, frankly, to participate in research right now. And something finally happened after the Christmas break where a lot of folks were willing and able to participate. So a lot of this is very new data that you're hearing about today. So what are some of the preliminary findings about how schools with these varying improvement capacities are dealing with a unique period of change? First, I find that regardless of school type, strong, weak, somewhere in the middle, all schools are struggling to respond to the pandemic, and all schools reference current challenges, kind of common challenges, regardless of type. So all schools are dealing with issues around student access to technology and the internet. All schools are struggling with student attendance. You have schools who normally had, 96 or 97% attendance, which are down to 80% attendance on a given day. Student engagement is a pervasive issue. You have students who are logging in for remote learning, but then not participating in the class in any way or turning on a camera. And so teachers don't even know if the student is there on the other side of the computer. You have massive staffing shortages because schools are being asked to teach in person and remote at the same time, requiring kind of twice as much staff as they've been allotted. You have real issues around staff and student morale. Relatedly, a lot of folks talked about kind of the lack of human connection. Even schools who have, quote, crushed remote learning, as one teacher said, lack kind of the motivation that comes from working with students day to day, face to face, seeing colleagues in the hallway, popping into classrooms. It's really missing for a lot of people. This dealing with constant change and uncertainty, new policy decisions coming out on a sometimes daily basis. And then one that we're going to talk in a great deal about towards the end of the presentation, the response of the DOE central office. That said, schools with higher improvement capacity have been more adaptive in responding to changing needs. So suggesting that, the theory around the elements of school improvement capacity and the practices of effective change leadership, even in a unique and uncertain environment, still prove salient for schools' kind of ability to cope and manage change. So I found examples in particularly the versatile and developing schools of leaders who are kind of regularly gathering feedback from multiple stakeholders, surveying parents, surveying teachers, using that feedback then to adapt their approach. For example, one school, received feedback from parents that students were having too many assignments and too much in-person instruction. It was overwhelming for the students and the parents. So the principal decided to cut back, ask the teachers to provide fewer assignments and to cut back on the amount of teaching each day. In another school, they had the opposite complaint. They were only providing one class worth of live instruction per day. They increased that because parents said it wasn't enough structure. So being kind of responsive to that feedback. Regularly communicating with parents and teachers about plans and expectations. These schools are having regular town halls, teacher meetings, sending out constant emails and newsletters, and actually report that parent engagement has increased in the pandemic compared to what they had earlier, in large part because most of that engagement is happening virtually, which is giving more parents an opportunity to log in and attend. And then really importantly, these leaders have ensured staff buy-in before they made any of these major changes. One could envision a scenario in which a school leader is asking teachers to teach one more class a day. That could be subject to a lot of pushback and backlash. but these leaders have really led with the data and been able to explain their rationale behind these decisions and have been able to keep staff morale high because of that. Teachers have been using collaborative work time to plan and troubleshoot together, so they're not as isolated dealing with these challenges. They've also prioritized student relationships and family communication. Many teachers say that they spend more time now reaching out to students and families and focused on students' social emotional needs compared to kind of traditional academic planning or grading tasks. And then finally, these schools have found ways to kind of leverage teacher capacity so that teachers who have greater facility with technology are able to share best practices or tools for virtual learning and help to build capacity of the larger staff. Importantly, these organizations are leveraging existing organizational structures and strengths to do this. Schools did not kind of suddenly create a process of surveying parents and teachers or suddenly create a process of collaborative team meetings. These were processes and systems that predated the pandemic that the schools were now able to leverage to deal with the challenges that they face. For example, one teacher in a versatile school described the school's advisory structure in which teachers meet with small groups of students regularly to kind of provide mentoring, communication, and support. And this teacher said, you know, the model has always been successful for communication and relationship building, but in this environment, that was huge because it makes the load on teachers a lot lighter. You don't feel like you have 60 kids to be responsible for. So rather than every teacher be responsible for every student that they teach, the advisor becomes kind of the key point person for the 15 students that they serve, freeing up the capacity of the staff. In another school, a principal described how the collaborative work periods that the school already had established before the pandemic became particularly influential once COVID happened. The principal says, I think remotely, the importance of collaboration is even more significant. We already have these collaborative structures in place. So yeah, we're still missing the let me stop by a classroom and check in about something, but we're able to very quickly shift to saying these are when these teams are meeting. This is the purpose of the teams. It's just happening remotely. So again, you know, these are just a few examples of the ways in which these higher capacity schools are leveraging existing structures to deal with a unique change. What I have found kind of counter to this is that the schools that lacked these structures to begin with have been unable to develop them given the existing capacity constraints that COVID has brought on. And this has really led to some severe challenges for teacher morale in some of these lower capacity schools. And you see a real difference in the way that teachers are talking about the work. So this first quote is not attributed, but it is to a lead teacher in a developing school. And listen to the way this teacher is kind of talking about the morale in the school currently. The teacher says, yes, it's overwhelming. Yes, there's a lot of work, but I think it's a lot of work every year. I think it's a different sense of overwhelming, if that makes sense. It's just different. So the teacher is acknowledging that, you know, this is a challenging situation, but, you know, schools are always dealing with change and they have structures in place to do this. So they're doing okay. Compare this to the way a teacher in a demoralized school talks about the current environment. I don't know how much longer I can teach 3 curriculums every day. If I'm losing steam, I can't even imagine what some other people are feeling. I'm getting to the point where I dread it. So schools that were, you know, already low in capacity before the pandemic lack the structures to support their teachers before the pandemic, have kind of left teachers isolated, and teacher morale is really suffering as a result. Another issue that has come up across all of the schools in the sample was the district's response to the pandemic. And a challenge that all schools agreed on universally was that the district's response has been wanting. And I included kind of a broad set of excerpts here just to demonstrate how pervasive this feeling was among school principals, other leaders, and teachers. A principal in a developing school says the central level, in my opinion, has demonstrated a complete failure in leadership. An assistant principal at a collaborative school shared, I can't think of anything the central office did that supported us. Everything was too little, too late. We got thermometers that didn't work. We got wipes that said, do not use around adults and human beings. People were already in the building. And so a lot of these kinks we had to work out once we were already putting ourselves at risk. A lead teacher in a versatile school. So this is, one of our highest capacity schools. The greatest challenge for me was the DOE. I've been ambivalent towards the DOE and Central for my career, but during this, I was just angry the whole time. This last quote on the page, an assistant principal in a demoralized school, I want to be very clear. The central office hasn't done a whole lot for anybody. And so what this has really done is left schools in a situation where they are all largely grappling with the exact same challenges alone. And so there is no centralized effort to connect them. When principals in the sample were asked where they are turning for support or for help, a few shared that they are talking with the staff or leadership teams within their schools. So yes, they're looking for help and looking for advice, but it's all limited to their own building. So schools that have higher capacity going into this are going to have more help to draw on, where those lower capacity schools are really struggling. A few principals kind of informally text or email with principal colleagues, but these are all informal networks that they have established. Quite a few principals shared that they're just going to the liquor store or going on long walks or trying to get some exercise. It's really a story about kind of every principal looking out for themselves and very little central guidance or support. So key takeaways so far. One is that school improvement capacity is absolutely salient to schools' pandemic responses. Yes, this is a unique crisis, but it doesn't require a unique way of thinking about organizational change and improvement. Ron Edmonds was onto something in 1979. We do know a lot about what it takes to kind of improve schools. These same elements, these same practices that we've been talking about for years now still prove relevant in a completely unique crisis. Another one that is interesting is that regardless of improvement capacity before the COVID-19 pandemic, many schools that have been most successful have engaged in some turnaround practices. So almost done a mini improvement process where the leader perhaps tighten control for a bit at the outset, standardize processes, let teachers know exactly what to expect, made sure there were clear expectations around the schedule, ensured safety and order. That was a big one. And then over time, started focusing more on kind of developing more innovative instruction. But there's almost like a Maslow's hierarchy of needs for the way organizations respond to change. And then finally, most importantly, that districts and surrounding environments can create conditions that support or hinder school change efforts. A lot of the research on school effectiveness and improvement and my original theoretical frame is very focused on what's happening inside of school buildings. But thus far, what my research has shown is that absolutely school capacity is important, but it is very much kind of happening within this broader environmental context that is further, in this case, kind of threatening and hindering schools, as one principal put it, from reaching their full potential. One can imagine a very different response in which higher capacity schools were perhaps paired with schools that had lower capacity, that were lacking some of these structures to share capacity and spread some of their supports. Unfortunately, that has not been the case. So what are some next steps? Clearly, there is a variation in school improvement capacity. And as I said, that likely interacts with environmental conditions to facilitate improvement. This suggests that we need to better understand not only what's happening in schools, but the extent to which intermediary organizations or those organizations at the kind of district or school support or charter level to create conditions that enable capacity sharing and development across organizations. As Matt said in the beginning, we recently submitted a proposal to the Spencer Foundation to look at how some of these middle tier organizations are trying to do just that. And I look forward to the opportunity to study this in more detail. As I said again, there is kind of a director's cut version of all of this available on Google Drive with even more slides and data to dig through for those who are interested in. But for now, I leave you with my contact information and look forward to any questions you have about my research. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Meg. I will be in charge of facilitating the discussion, I believe. And so, Meg Holland, is that right? Should people just send me questions, or?
Yes, they can send questions directly to you, or they can put them in the chat. They can also raise their hands, and then we can unmute them and they can ask the questions themselves. So whatever folks are most comfortable with, and we can proceed. I actually already have one question in the queue, and let me scroll back up to that. So the question is, was it possible to observe differences between traditional public schools and charter schools in this sampling?
Yes. So the sample does include traditional and charter schools. Interestingly, while I looked to see if there was any relationship between school sector and school improvement capacity, that did not exist. So charters and traditional schools are equally likely to appear in all of these improvement capacity groups.
Meg, I thought I would jump in here with a question.
Sure.
If other people
are marinating.
and people, please continue to send your questions or ask Meg to be unmuted. So I was wondering if you could say anything about sort of the balance, like you were talking about structures and how important structures were to this, and having structures before this whole COVID started, and then that those transferred over. But I was wondering if you could say anything about, like, how much do you think in improvement generally, and in this instance in particular, how much of this ability to adapt is about structure, and how much of it is sort of about like the sort of the human element of it, of like the people in the building and getting the right people? So I was wondering if you could say anything about sort of what your thoughts are about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely both issues. Something that has come up, it comes up in kind of the framing around kind of effective leadership practices, which include things like hiring the right people and developing capacity, building trust between people in the building. And it certainly came up in the qualitative, or has come up in the qualitative data collection. You know, leaders who operate in versatile and developing schools, who had higher levels of trust with their faculty to begin with, had an easier time kind of maintaining that trust and steering the ship through these uniquely kind of uncertain and dysfunctional times. I have one school in my sample, which, believe it or not, has a principal who just started this year. So they are brand new to the school context, have no relationship with the staff, have no established trust, and are dealing with a uniquely uncertain crisis. And the struggles that this school has faced trying to kind of establish those connections and get people on the same page, while also kind of building structures, it has really proven a challenge for staff morale and for their ability to kind of manage the changes that they're up against. So I think it's absolutely a combination of the kind of structural element and then the human relationship element as well.
Thanks. Thanks.
Thank you.
A bunch of questions are coming in, and I'll sort of try to group them. There's a couple questions here about sort of the change in the composition and the turnover in schools during the period. So one question says, were you able to account for personnel changes in the buildings? And then also a related question about, given that sort of removal of school leaders and leadership teams is been used as a quote unquote solution to poor performance.
Yep.
Can you say anything about leadership turnover and how that might impact? So that's a lot, but.
Nope, great questions. So unfortunately, New York City does not provide school level data about teacher turnover. They only provide district level data about teacher turnover. So while I agree that is a really important question, as the shifting teacher perceptions may be to some extent representative of shifting teachers in the schools themselves, unfortunately, the data does not allow me to investigate that question, but it's a great one. The second question about principal turnover, though, I did investigate. So I actually looked at whether principal turnover interacts with the likelihood that schools change between classes. This is one of those things that I threw into the appendix of the presentation. And I did find a few transitions that were influenced by leadership turnover. Not a ton, but I mean, you have to remember part of that could be a sample size issue. Yes, I'm working with 1,200 schools, but within each of these transitions, some of them are maybe 20 or 30 schools that are moving from one group to another. But some of the transitions that I found were influenced by leadership turnover included schools that had been versatile in 2017. If they experienced leadership turnover, were more likely to move into the demoralized group, believe it or not, in 2018. So kind of a huge drop for those schools. But again, if you're interested in kind of looking at that further, I encourage you to look at the appendices of the presentation, which look at some of those interactions.
Great, thank you.
Sure.
There's another question about, did you see any connection between your categories and school outcomes or school rankings? So your measures were based on the surveys of the teachers, but
Yep.
sort of what connections were there? Is that something you've looked at?
Yes, I did look at the connections between school improvement capacity, school trajectories, and school outcomes in 2019 in both math and ELA. What's interesting is, that versatile subgroup, not surprisingly, did have the strongest outcomes. The demoralized group did have the, lowest outcomes, but there weren't differences, statistically significant differences, between the demoralized, the controlled, and the balkanized subgroups. But when we look at the capacity of the school, the elements in which those schools are strong and weak, we see very different organizational strengths and weaknesses. And this is why, in the beginning, I talked about how sometimes we tend to group schools based on student outcomes and take all the struggling schools and kind of give them all the same improvement, strategies, same improvement intervention, when really those schools that are struggling might be struggling in different ways. It's kind of like that Anna Karenina, all happy families are the same, unhappy families are, unhappy in different ways. There's heterogeneity among struggling schools. And so just looking at student outcomes, which is, what we tend to do, is maybe masking some of those differences, which could be really important when we think about improvement interventions.
Great, thank you. A few people have asked questions sort of related to the supports or lack thereof that district leadership provided to schools.
Mm-hmm.
One person in particular said, I'm aware of a number of robust and formal opportunities for interaction and support created by a number of school divisions in Virginia. So do you have a thought about why, you would hear something different in New York City, like compared to, why was that something that particularly you think was going on there in terms of this lack of support and that people were feeling?
It's a great question. I mean, I can conjecture. I don't really have a lot of data to base this on. Part of the issue for New York is it is such a large district, and it has kind of been a perennial problem for the city to figure out the best way to support such a diverse and just immense number of schools. We're talking over 1,800 schools here in New York. I think another element that has been a real challenge here is that you have mayoral control, but then you have a mayor and a governor who are kind of constantly feuding, which may take some of the attention away from some of the ways in which the city can be supporting schools, because a lot of energy is put into that kind of level of the political sphere. But also just kind of this fact that the city generally has had kind of very inconsistent policies around when schools should be open, when they should be closed. There's been a lot of focus and a lot of struggle to kind of get students access to technology and internet. The need for kind of logistical technical assistance was so high. I think it really strained the capacity of the central office to respond to kind of these more pressing needs around teaching and learning supports, which were really difficult. And then, of course, we, know research tells us that central offices are traditionally not, super high capacity when it comes to supporting teaching and learning to begin with. So lots of different possible reasons why that could be the case. I'd be interested to hear more about what's happening in Virginia, because it might shed some light on some, key differences in the context between the two sites.
There's a question. Were you surprised by how many schools moved between the demoralized and the highest tier? And do you have any hypotheses about what had caused those such drastic changes there in the perceptions of teachers?
No, it actually was a pretty small percentage of schools that moved from the demoralized to the highest tier. I'm looking now. It's only 5% of schools move from the demoralized to the versatile group. So it's not a huge group of schools. I would definitely be interested in figuring out, how that happened. Is that real transition, or is that maybe just teachers filling in some different things on their school survey? That would be, what I think is really exciting about this work is it opens up a whole realm of kind of improvement pathways that are interesting for further exploration and further qualitative work. It'd be really interesting to dig into that group and look at what's happening there in more detail for sure.
All right, thank you. Another question, I think maybe we have time for just one or two more looking at the clock, but there's a lot to choose from here. So what were the characteristics of the versatile schools in part one, aside from charter traditional? And I think this kind of gets at a bigger question of sort of, what other characteristics did the schools have who seem to have the best capacities? So the question says, did zip code matter, wealth, affiliations with partners, and the question is, could versatility be more a function of factors outside of schools rather than within, or some combination of home and school?
Yeah, I think so. Yes, definitely. So the kind of part of the LT that I did not focus on so much was looking at, correlations between subgroup belonging and these kind of contextual covariates compared to the versatile subgroup. All the other subgroups were more likely to be larger, have higher percentages of African American students, serve more students with disabilities, serve more English language learners. Those developing and demoralized schools were also more likely to have higher percentages of inexperienced teachers. So these are, some of the differences we might expect to see based on the previous literature about kind of high performing and struggling schools. So yes, all that is true. What's interesting to me is in the kind of final model, when I looked at the relationship between these different school improvement capacities and student outcomes, I control for all those contextual covariates. And even after controlling for those contextual covariates, I still find a relationship between school improvement capacity and student outcomes, suggesting that yes, there is certainly a relationship between improvement capacity and student outcomes. But at the end of the day, this school improvement capacity is telling us something about the organization beyond what we could know from those kind of contextual factors alone.
Great, well, thank you. Well, I see that we are at the end of time. I apologize to those who have questions here that I didn't get to. I tried to put them together as much as I can, but I encourage you all, to reach out to Meg with any further questions that you have. Just want to thank you again, Meg, for joining us. This has been really interesting. Meg has sent out her email address again. So thank you, Meg, and thank you everybody for joining.
Thanks so much for facilitating, Matt. I really appreciate it. Thanks, everyone.